Good afternoon, my friends. This is the Grim Flayer. Hope you're all doing very well today, and I hope you are ready for me to cover the remnants, the remainders of the Ikoria spoilers, and give them the will they rock treatment. You'll have to excuse me. I'm a little bit out of breath. I am multitasking right now. I'm going to do a segment, and then I'm going to go do a set. I'm doing a workout at home. I'm doing a shoulder day. What can I say when you are working through a pandemic and when you've got a couple of kids under 3 at home? You just have to multitask sometimes, so it's actually pretty cool. I got the blood flowing. Hopefully it'll get the ideas flowing too. Yeah, you can't see it under my blood-stained fur mantle here, but I do have a shoulder pump going on. It's kind of cool. We're having fun working out and talking about spoilers alternately. So without further ado, let's dive right in. Thank you so much to all Patreon supporters, and I hope you guys find this useful and entertaining. We're going to talk about 7 Ikoria cards, Will They Rock, beginning right now. Alright, first up, it is Heartless Act. This is a new Doomblade variant. It is technically a modal spell. You can destroy target creature with no counters on it, or remove up to 3 counters from target creature, but it's a little bit of a weak modal spell. Now, the reason we're talking about it is because just occasionally, in non-Jund BGX variants, you will see people register the occasional one of Doomblade, whether usually, and obviously not Doomblade itself in Modern, but we're talking about cards like Cast Down or Go for the Throat are probably the 2 most common, and Heartless Act is competitive with those cards to the extent that that matters for us, and I think specifically right now is better than Cast Down. The non-legendary clause on Cast Down, not really well positioned at all these days. Go for the Throat seems okay right now though, so, maybe Go for the Throat is still better than Heartless Act. But, removing counters from a creature is cute, but it's not different enough from destroy target creature that it's really all that appealing. Somebody on my Discord, I don't recall who right now, pointed out that it would be actually pretty cool if it was choose one or both. That way you could have a literal or a pseudo 2-for-1 against like a Hardened Scales deck or against humans. Especially, it would be cool to, like, shrink a huge champion of the parish and destroy something else with one card, and that would be pretty sweet, and it would definitely not be busted that way. Another thing that occurs to me is you could say this would probably not be choose one or both, it would probably just be choose one, but if this said remove up to 3 counters from target, maybe permanent is pushing it. Might be a little too good against to have like a Doomblade that can also kill some planeswalkers or really shrink the planeswalkers, but maybe target creature or artifact would be cool. I'm thinking like resetting an Ether Vial, making a Chalice of the Void neutered. That would be a really cool use of a modal Doomblade. But we don't have that, we just kind of have a relatively underwhelming, potentially playable alternative to Go for the Throat. Again, to the extent that matters, that might not be all that relevant, but it is worth putting it on your radar in case you do want to reach for a card like that in a certain metagame. But the takeaway here to me is clear. We've got all these disgustingly powerful threats just entering the format with every set. We've got combo enablers, we've got recursive value, we've got ridiculously pushed planeswalkers, and then all the traditional interaction that they print is either so narrow as to not be especially playable, or if it is broadly playable, I'm thinking of like Assassin's Trophy here, it comes with a massive downside. So what's the deal, Wizards? What is the deal? Here's the takeaway. Print better interaction, you cowards, you fools. We need better interaction in Modern. Signed, the BGX gang. And next, let's talk about Chevill. Or maybe Chevill. I'm going to call him Chevill, Bane of Monsters. This guy's just cool AF, Chad energy just radiating off this dude. He's got the open jacket with no shirt on underneath. He's got a gigantic necklace, and he's got the mustache. There's a lot to like. His name even begins with a CH. So yeah, Chad confirmed. Guy is cool, but will he rock in Modern? I don't think so. I wish he did. He's, again, very cool, and he does a lot of what we want to do, like the structure of the card specifically rewards us for interacting with removal spells, which is exactly what our deck already wants to do. Here's the problem. You've got to jump through about 4 hoops before you start getting value off of him, so he's extraordinarily conditional, and those hoops are slow. It's not like if the stars align and you find him and you have everything ready to go, you just get to go off there. So it's both slow and conditional, and his floor is not not proactive enough. His floor as a 2-mana, 1-power threat, even with Death Touch, even with Toughness 3, it is not good enough to just attack and put pressure on the opponent while maybe threatening to gain value some other time later in the game. So I don't think he's going to rock. Here's what I mean about 4 hoops. First of all, you've got to play him and then wait until the beginning of your upkeep before you even put a bounty counter on anything. So that's very significant. You find him on curve or on turn 10, it doesn't matter. Even if you have the removal in hand ready to go, you gotta wait. You gotta wait until your next upkeep. So you gotta wait basically a full turn cycle. And then your opponent has to have a viable target, a creature or planeswalker. And then you have to have removal that in your hand that lines up against them already. And then you have to have, your removal has to still resolve after you've waited a full turn cycle. So your opponent has that extra chance to force it out of your hand with discard, or to untap and draw permission, or just to untap and have permission at the ready. So as you can see, this is just too unrealistic for Modern, if you ask me. On top of all that, it's not a game-winning thing. If you do jump through all of those hoops successfully, you gain 3 life and you draw a card. Okay, yeah, obviously that's good value. It reminds me a lot of Uro, but it's not, Uro's great because he's just ETB, you get that stuff, and you make a land drop, you get to ramp. Chevill is way too conditional, way too slow, unfortunately. The final thing I want to say is that, think of all the games you played on BGX. If your removal spells are already lining up against the opponent's board, you're usually winning anyway. The games we lose tend to be when we draw the wrong half of the deck, leaving aside Mana Screw, Mana Flood, opponent nut draws and stuff. You got the wrong half of the deck problem more than anything else on BGX, and Chevill does not solve that whatsoever, so he is very win more and also very slow. He might be a little bit more appealing in Traverse because he does not violate the Lurrus Companion stipulation, and also you can tutor him with Traverse if things look like they're going to line up well for him. I still don't know if he's going to outcompete any of the other 2-drop threats. I kind of doubt it, but he might be a little more appealing there, and hey, maybe he's good in Pioneer, but I'm going to leave that one to the Pioneer experts, and I'm going to say, unfortunately, even though he's pretty sweet, and even though nominally he fits our game plan, we gotta pass. He's not gonna rock in Modern. And next up, we gotta talk about Footfall Crater. This is a really interesting 1-drop red enchantment that enchants a land. It's an aura, and you can tap it to have target creature gain trample and haste until end of turn. So you know who really likes that is Tarmogoyf. Tarmogoyf thrives on those keywords, especially in a Mishra's Bauble Traverse Shell where the Goyfs are going to be huge very, very early. On top of that, this card cycles for the low cost of 1 generic mana, so you have a lot of use cases here. If you have a good board, you're ahead on board, you can use this to attack over weenies and to grant haste to end the game as quickly and efficiently as possible. If you're behind on board, or you're even and you think it's better to cycle and see a fresh card, or if you just want to turn on Delirium ASAP with putting a rare type into the graveyard and cantripping for only 1 mana, Footfall Crater does all of those things. Finally, in Lurrus builds, which of course is what I'm talking about whenever I talk about Traverse and Modern right now, this can be bought back. So this is yet another thing that Lurrus can buy back from the graveyard. So you can loop it just to keep cycling, you can cycle it once and then buy it back, and then you use it for the trample and haste ability. It is worth noting that there's some redundancy, some overlap with the secondary Tarmogoyf for the deck, which is Grimflayer, because he already has trample, but haste on Grimflayer is very, very good. The problem with Grim is sometimes surviving a full turn to connect with him and start getting your card selection and your graveyard value, but with haste, of course, you're a lot more likely to. So, it's hard to find slots for spicy 1-ofs because there's a deck full of spicy 1-ofs if you're building any kind of Lurrus Traverse build right now, and it's unclear how it's all going to come together, but I think this card is very, very promising in that archetype, and just for the sake of completion, people have been talking about it in regular Jund as well. I think it does fit Lurrus Traverse a little bit better, and people might play this in Shadow and in whatever else, but for BGX purposes, I think it's really promising. I think this could rock. I think more accurately, it could Jund, it could Traverse, it could Lurrus, and you guys will have to let me know, as always, what you think about this and about everything else we're talking about here today. And then we'll move on to Fiend Artisan. So this card is really interesting. I think it is one of the most powerful cards of the set. And I think, despite that, it will definitely not rock. It will not fit into traditional BGX decks without building around it. So it kind of does two things. The first mode on the card is kind of its plan B. It's kind of its backup mode. You could see it as like an auxiliary Tarmogoyf. You know, it's going to grow based on the graveyard, and that's all well and good. But in traditional BGX decks, our threat counts are not that high. We're not actively putting a ton of them into the graveyard. Like, occasionally we will discard a creature to Liliana or to Collective Brutality, but most of the time we're not spending our spells to fill up the graveyard. We will just have things go to the graveyard incidentally as we interact. And as far as doing that proactively in the ways that we like, creatures don't go there that often compared to sorceries and instants, right? So Fiend Artisan, auxiliary Tarmogoyf, it's a little underwhelming, you know, 2/2, 3/3, maybe 4/4 by the mid game in a grindy matchup. It's not all that great, but it is a respectable, you know, aspect of the card, don't get me wrong. But the real attraction to the card is its birthing pod mode, where you tap it, you spend some mana, you sack another creature to tutor a different creature to the battlefield at sorcery speed, and that is a fantastic ability, and that combined with its kind of plan B Tarmogoyf mode is why I think the card's really strong. But again, it's not a great fit in BGX, is it? Because we don't play expendable creatures. That's not our thing. Like, whenever effects like this come up, it's tempting to say, well, you can cash in a Bob. You really don't want to cash in Bob most of the time. And if you do need to cash in Bob, it means you're probably absolutely flush with resources and you can do it some other way. It's kind of the same thing with Vraska Golgari Queen. It's like, when she's well positioned, it's because her Abrupt Decay effect is good, and maybe because we're playing Tireless Tracker and you want to have the access to cash in those clues really efficiently. That's like a realistic use case of cashing in a permanent for good value and good tempo. In this case, we don't have good creatures that are good sacrifice targets to justify the inclusion of this card and justify using our entire turn to do it, right? This is a slow ability, especially in the context of our deck that's not ramping with mana. So I think Fiend Artisan is very strong, and I think there could be a BGX shell that incorporates it and has more of a toolbox approach, and maybe again this ties into Lurrus Traverse. I don't exactly know. I don't think it slots directly into the Lurrus Traverse builds I've been talking about personally, but it is a little more appealing there. But you want to build around this more. You want to play expendable creatures. You want to play something like a Stitcher Supplier that gets you value when it comes down, gets you value when you sack it, and is cheap. That's the type of card you want to include alongside Fiend Artisan. We don't play those in BGX decks, so I think for Modern, it will not rock in traditional BGX. Next up, we got Extinction Event. This is a really tricky one to rate for me. Just for me, some of you might have a clearer perspective or a clearer opinion on this. I think it's a little bit tough to rate because there's a lot going on here. It's a damnation for all intents and purposes, in that is a 4 mana sorcery speed sweeper effect, but unlike damnation, it does not provide a hard reset. So that's the big counter argument to this, is that, you know, when you're in those situations where damnation is really what you need to draw, you really do usually need to kill the entire board. Like, when damnation's your only out, you can't afford to leave a creature or two around against the opponent's deck, because you're still going to die to those, right? And beyond that, damnation doesn't really see play anymore. Damnation has kind of been outclassed these days by Modern, and or it's just not quite as well positioned in the meta as it once was. So those two things make me skeptical of Extinction Event. However, there are two countervailing points that make it potentially appealing and potentially better, at least in some spots, than Damnation. So, number one, it's kind of more like akin to Languish in one sense, in that some of our things, some of the time, will survive it. So that's not nothing. That's pretty cool, you know. Sometimes with Damnation, it's the gotta crack a few eggs to make an omelet style of approach, and you just gotta kind of wipe the board and lose maybe two of your own creatures that didn't get ETB value. It kind of sucks. Extinction Event, in theory, That won't always happen. Perhaps more importantly, though, and not to reduce that importance of what I just said, but perhaps more importantly for this actually finding a playable niche in our archetype is the fact that it does exile, and exiling is always at a premium, guys. I don't think that's ever really going to change in Modern. The graveyard is a major zone where people get value and get synergy and sometimes build their entire strategy around, so the fact that it does exile is a little bit of a rarity in black, and therefore it could be even more appealing in Jund, for example, a color grouping that does not traditionally have access to playable exile effects. So the fact that we do have a meta where Dredge has a presence, the fact that it does exile Uro and Kroxa and some other things that do have recursive potential, honestly, that is a real appeal to the card. Finally, it is an open question. If you test this card, should you build around it? Should you say, okay, I'm going to look at the meta and I'm going to say it's most likely going to be used on odd more often than not, therefore I'm going to try to play as few odd creatures as possible. So maybe if you have like a flex slot that could go to a tireless tracker, you want to opt for something with an even CMC instead, or maybe something that's a non-creature in that slot that's value-oriented like Liliana the Last Hope. That's just an example, but you understand the point. All these moving pieces is why it's a little bit hard for me to give a hard and fast rating on it. I think it's interesting, and I think if you're inclined to test it, you should, because not everybody's going to be testing it, and I think that's the only way to really get to grips with this card, and it might kind of wax and wane and come in and out of sideboards based on the meta. It might also just not be good enough to see play. Again, we don't play Damnation anymore, and this is a much less of a hard reset than Damnation is, and if you're reaching for a 4-mana sorcery speed sweeper effect, you probably want a hard reset most of the time. So I don't want to oversell the card, but I want to give it its due. I think it's interesting, and I think if you want to test it, you should. Next up, we've got Dire Tactics. It is 1 white, 1 black, instant, exile target creature. If you don't control a human, you lose life equal to that creature's toughness, so this applies to Abzan, and I see this as the Abzan Terminate, and exile is better than the Terminate clause of can't be regenerated this turn, for sure. However, if you don't control a human, you lose life equal to that creature's toughness, so this does come with a downside. It's almost like a hybrid Terminate, Dismember, Path to Exile. It like borrows from different traits or different upsides or downsides of each of those cards. And I make it sound like it's better than it is by describing it that way, so maybe that wasn't the most apt descriptor, but you understand what I'm getting at here. I think to the extent that Jund decks register a Terminate, it is because they want an extra removal spell that is relatively unconditional. Like, you just want that overload of removal, and you don't want it to be push or bolt, because you want it to be able to reach higher than that. You want it to be able to tag, like, a Thought-Knot Seer, for example. Dire Tactics, I think, can be the Terminate of Abzan. Exile is icing on the cake. Exile is really good. It makes it much better against Wormcoil Engine than Terminate would be. It makes it much better against Uro and Kroxa than Terminate would be. And yes, if you are getting those cards, like, escaped against you in the case of the Titans, or if Tron is on 6+ mana, you're kind of in trouble already, so it's not like, aha, I've answered your payoff and now I'm going to win. It's just a generically playable removal spell that might also have the ability to answer payoffs that we otherwise might struggle to answer. And if that's the case, well, we are able to stay competitive some of the time on the back of a card like this. Finally, in Abzan, most decks will be playing either Dark Confidant and or Tireless Tracker and or some other humans some of the time as well, so it's not like you always have to have the life loss baked into the cake. And don't get me wrong, there is a real non-bow there where, by definition, if you're killing creatures, they're almost always attacking your life total. Often that's their main game plan to win, and playing a life loss kill spell that only hits creatures. There is something non-Bowie about that. There is something a little bit redundant or a little bit unintuitive about that. Redundant's not the right word. A little bit non-Bowie, a little bit unintuitive, especially if we're talking about BGX, where you do have the catch-alls like Pulse, Trophy, and Decay. So that's why I don't want to oversell Dire Tactics. Again, I think it is best considered to be the Terminate of Abzan, and as such, you want it in your maybe board. I think I would begin testing it as a one of, probably main deck, just to see it more often and see how it goes, but it is an interesting card, and it is potentially a role player in Abzan 75s. And finally, my friends, we have to talk about Indatha Triome, which is the Abzan Tri-land. It is fetchable, so it's a plains, a swamp, and a forest. It makes all three, but it always ETBs tapped. However, you can cycle it for 3 generic mana, so there's a lot going on here. Do we want it? Well, I don't know. I don't think it's a free roll inclusion, because do not ever underestimate how bad it is to have a land ETB tapped. And is it better to play this over a creature land just because it cycles for 3? I think that's pretty debatable. I think Shambling Vent, for example, is a pretty strong land, and I think in a vacuum it's stronger than cycling for 3, making the 2/3 lifelink. And that definitely does not take into account the mana fixing. The mana fixing is what can put this over the top into the realm of playability. Do we need this type of mana fixing in Abzan? I would say right now, no, we don't need it. We don't need it. So on Abzan, you need double black on turn 3, and you need single black on turn 1 for Liliana and for discard or push, respectively. You also have Scavenging Ooze demanding as much green mana as possible. If we had similarly high demands on white mana, then I think we would definitely play this as a one-of. Like, if we had a double white spell that we needed to cast by turn 3, on curve and we wanted 18 white sources, then yeah, you're probably reaching for a Triome, or you're probably cutting Skoos from your deck. So in that case, I think Triome would be great. But we don't have that incentive on Abzan right now. We only need white on turn 2 for Stoneforge Mystic. It's not that demanding. The most demanding card is probably like a one-of Gideon Ally of Zendikar. Double white on turn 2 needing 16 white sources. You can even accommodate that relatively easily while doing everything else I said without the Triome. So if we had more mana-hungry white cards, I would say this would definitely be playable. Since we don't, I don't think it's necessary, but it also might still be playable, because don't get me wrong, even when you've got that 90% chance to get the colors you need at the times you need them, it doesn't hurt to up those numbers even more. And it never hurts to have a cycling ability, because the games do go really long. You can really get flooded. Yes, it's a very, very poor cycling ability relative to Barrenmore or those Onslaught cyclers, or even compared to the Amonkhet cyclers, but hey, it's a Tri-land at the same time. So I think this is a 0-1 in Abzan. It might also, the fact that it is a Tri-land might enable you to play greedier utility lands, like Treetop Village, for example. You could build a mana base with this with the express purpose of keeping your colors consistent while playing a card like Treetop Village. So I think you should actually run the numbers, actually sit down with your list and see what your color demands are, see what lands you wish to play before you just automatically include or exclude the Indatha Triome from your Abzan list. And I think it's something you'll want to have around, though, as a one-of, because if we do get like a double white requiring 3-drop that we want to play, then that's the time where this card will become mostly necessary. But for now, I see it as a 0-1 of. I think it's testable, I think it's fine, I think it's playable. Let me know your thoughts on this and on everything else we've talked about here. I would love to hear them in the comments below. Alright guys, so the video has come to an end, and so has my shoulder workout. I hope I wasn't too out of breath for some of those segments. It was kind of cool to, rip off a set and then come back here to the computer and rip off a segment and just go back and forth. You gotta multitask sometimes, right? Otherwise, you become delirious because you just don't get enough done. Gotta stay healthy during the pandemic, right? So anyway, my friends, I hope you are all out there staying healthy, being well, being safe, and I hope this was entertaining and or useful for you. If there's anything I didn't cover that you want my opinion on, ask me in the comments below. And if there is anything you disagree on, or you want to share an alternative line of thinking on, or if you just want to agree with what I'm saying, frankly, all of that's welcome. So let it rip in the comments below as always, and if you've got any preliminary testing in as well, feel free to share those data points with the viewership. I thank you so much for watching. Stay tuned for the next video. We are going to play Ikoria stuff in Modern, coming very soon. Thanks again, and I will talk to you next time.